So today, we're really zeroing in on that recent keynote by the game director of a big MMORPG. We want to unpack the logic behind their design ideas.
Right, and we're looking closely at a pretty detailed analysis of that speech. It's critical, doesn't just accept things. It asks, does this actually make sense long term, especially given the game's history?
Exactly. So your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to get past the buzzwords and really understand what's going on with modern MMO design.
We'll look at potential problems in their thinking, maybe some missteps.
And see what we can learn from, successes and failures in these kinds of games. So let's get into it. The director started by talking about being player first, basically adapting to what players are doing now instead of sticking to some fixed plan.
Yeah, and the analysis immediately flags that as, well, risky, it sounds good, player first, right? But the argument is, if you only react to current trends, or, the loudest voices on the forums or in meta discussions, you might actually be pushing away a lot of other players. People who maybe, like the game's original, feel its core identity, maybe a slower pace.
So the vocal minority ends up shaping the game.
Potentially, yeah. The analysis suggests that could be happening. It might detract from what maybe a quieter, broader group actually enjoys.
Right, and they use cross-faction grouping as an example. Players ask for it, sure, but the analysis asks, did that dilute the whole faction conflict thing? Which was pretty core to the game's theme.
Exactly. It makes you question, whose definition of player first are we using here? And what's the trade-off for the game's identity down the line?
It definitely brings up that idea of availability bias, doesn't it? Mistaking the loudest opinions for what everyone thinks.
Absolutely. The easiest opinions to find aren't always the most representative. Satisfied players often don't post essays online.
They're too busy playing.
Right. So if you're only reactive, you risk chasing those loud opinions and maybe losing what made the game special in the first place. You could end up with something, blander.
Okay, let's shift to the next big idea. Paving the dirt trail. This concept of embracing the shortcuts or paths players naturally create in the game.
Yeah, director framed it as letting players guide development organically. Sounds nice and hands-off.
But the analysis wasn't buying it.
Not entirely. It argues that in MMOs, a lot of these desire paths aren't just innocent fun. They're often what the source calls degenerate optimizations.
Degenerate optimizations, like what?
Think boosting services, GDKP runs, where people basically buy raid loot with gold or constantly resetting dungeons just for hyper efficiency. Player-driven, yes, but maybe not healthy for the overall game.
Ah, okay, so just because players do it doesn't mean the developer should encourage it or build it into the game structure.
Precisely. And the analysis points out the downsides if you do codify those shortcuts. You can get faster power creep, meaning gear becomes obsolete quicker.
Right.
It can mess with the in-game economy, cause inflation, and it can totally undermine the intended pacing, making everything feel rushed, maybe cheapening the story or the sense of achievement.
So the game becomes less of an adventure, more of a grind.
Could be. The long-term risk is a game that feels more like a treadmill, less rewarding.
I like the analogy they use the urban park. You don't just pave over every single path people cut across the grass, right?
Exactly, because the park here is also the game's economy, its story, its systems. You need some hedges, as the source put it, to protect the intended experience.
Makes sense. Okay, what about this idea of fun today, elegance tomorrow? The director seemed to justify constantly rebuilding systems, talents, borrowed power, that kind of thing.
Yeah, the argument being that immediate fun is key, and they can sort out the mess later. Keep things fresh, stop stagnation in the short term.
Which, again, sounds okay on the surface. Constant updates, new things to learn.
But the analysis brings up this concept of a technical debt spiral. Every temporary system, every quick fix, it leaves behind clutter.
Like old code lying around.
Or just, UI elements that don't make sense anymore, confusing tooltips, layers upon layers of complexity that make it really hard for new players to even start.
So the game gets harder to maintain and more intimidating over time.
That's the potential long-term impact, yeah. And it's not just technical stuff. The source mentioned rework fatigue.
Oh yeah, I think a lot of players feel it. You spend time learning a system.
And then bam, it's gone next expansion.
Yeah.
Or totally changed. The analysis mentioned things like Azeroth, Covenants, and Shadowlands, even the Dragonflight talent changes.
Right.
This constant churn, it can really erode player trust. Why bother investing deeply if it's just going to be scrapped? Does it feel fresh or just unstable?
Yeah.
That's the question.
Okay, let's talk balance. Hot fixes. The director argued for frequent tuning, like every couple of weeks, saying it manages player perception better than trying to get balance perfect at launch.
And the source pushes back on that. Firstly, these rapid meta shifts. They can be super frustrating if you're playing competitively. You feel like you constantly have to chase the latest buffs.
Always changing your spec or character.
Exactly. And it can make gear differences feel even worse between players who can adapt instantly and those who can't or don't want to.
Yeah.
It feels unstable, potentially creates barriers.
And the analysis also suggested these hot fixes might just be papering over cracks, right?
Yep.
Not fixing the real problems.
That's a key point. If the real imbalance comes from, say, overpowered trinkets or temporary borrowed power systems or weird raid buff interactions, just tweaking ability numbers might not do much.
It's like treating the symptom, not the cause.
Precisely. And the source notes something interesting. Even though the actual DPS differences between classes are much smaller now than years ago, player complaints about balance are still really high.
So the numbers are closer, But people are still unhappy.
Yeah, which suggests the problem isn't just the numbers. Maybe it's deeper system issues, maybe it's how things are communicated. These quick fixes might not be building a truly satisfying, stable core game.
Got it. Now, this next point was interesting, the StarCraft analogy.
Yeah.
The director compared WoW W balance to StarCraft, Brood War, how it's meta-stabilized over time after the last patch.
Right, suggesting things can just sort of self-correct eventually.
But the analysis called that comparison flawed?
Very flawed, according to the source. It highlights the massive difference between a 1v1 esport with fixed units and abilities and a huge MMO raid with, dozens of players, countless gear combinations, talent interactions, consumables. The complexity is just worlds apart.
It's not even apples and oranges. It's like apples and a complex ecosystem.
Pretty much. And the source also points out that Brood War balance often shifted because of map changes, not unit changes, whereas WoW's balance issues often come from its progression systems, gear, borrowed power, etc.
So relying on that analogy might let the developers off the hook for actually fixing underlying design problems in WoW's systems.
That's the concern raised, yeah. Blaming time instead of tackling the design itself.
Okay, the analysis also spotted some inconsistencies, like how the director talked about being generous and iterating quickly, but then described rolling out big changes like cross-faction play very slowly and cautiously.
Yeah, that contradiction stood out. On one hand, it's pave the desired paths quickly, adapt, iterate.
Right.
But then for something like cross-faction, suddenly it's, whoa, slow down, this is irreversible, we need to be careful. It makes you wonder if there's one set of rules for some changes and another set for others.
So is cross-faction just a minor dirt path to pave quickly? Or is it a fundamental change needing caution? The philosophy seems flexible, let's say.
Flexible, yes.
Yeah.
Or maybe inconsistent, which leads nicely into the whole subscription model thing. The director framed the sub fee as aligning their goals with player fun. We only make money if you're having fun playing.
Sounds good in principle. Keep players subscribed by keeping them happy.
But the analysis immediately points to the elephant in the room, the cash shop, boosts, gold tokens.
Right, things that let you bypass parts of the game by paying real money.
Exactly. The source argues these things directly monetize friction in the game, the time it takes to level, the effort to get gold. So if you're monetizing the annoying bits...
It kind of undermines the claim that your only goal is maximizing fun through the sub fee.
Precisely. There's a potential conflict there. Is it purely about player experience, or is there a tension with these other revenue streams? It weakens the sub fee aligns everything argument.
Okay, that makes sense. What about ability pruning? The director suggested the backlash was just developers misreading what players wanted.
Well, the analysis offers a different take. It wasn't necessarily that players rejected simplicity. They rejected losing cool, iconic, meaningful abilities.
Abilities that defined their class.
Yeah. Especially when those were often replaced by temporary, complicated, borrowed power systems that felt like chores. So the source argues the director might have misdiagnosed the problem. It wasn't don't simplify, it was don't take away the good stuff and replace it with complex, busy work.
That's a subtle but really important distinction. It's about the quality and permanence of abilities, not just the number of buttons.
Exactly. Then there's the use of data. The director showed data tighter DPS spreads and raids, but noted players still complain a lot about balance, maybe implying the complaints are irrational.
But the analysis says there's missing context there.
Definitely. In high-end rating, it's not just about the raw numbers, it's about relative performance.
How you stack up against other classes for that specific fighter role.
Right. Even small percentage differences can matter hugely because of strict raid requirements, social pressure within guilds, wanting to contribute effectively.
So a 3% difference might look small on a spreadsheet, but feel massive in practice.
Could be. Plus, the source mentions how online discussions, streamers, guides, they amplify these things. Player perception is tied to the meta, the community narrative, not just the raw data. Ignoring that context risks misunderstanding why players are actually frustrated.
Okay, last big point. Trust. The director called trust the ultimate currency. Which sounds right, of course.
It does, but the analysis brings it back down to earth. It points to a history of, issues, expansions launching, feeling unfinished.
Shadowlands covenants needing big changes post-launch, that kind of thing. Launch day bugs being almost expected.
Exactly. The argument is player trust gets worn down by these recurring problems. Promising quick fixes after launch doesn't build trust as much as shipping something polished and complete to begin with.
So it's about being proactive with quality, not just reactive with fixes.
That seems to be the core message from the analysis. You build trust by consistently delivering, not by constantly having to apologize and patch things up later. Focus on preventing the wounds, not just applying band-aids.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. This deep dive into the analysis suggests some real questions about the director's philosophy. Maybe too much focus on reacting, not enough long-term vision.
Yeah, and the risks of just adopting any player behavior, even the degenerate ones, without thinking through the impact.
The cost of constant system churn, that a rework fatigue and technical debt.
And those inconsistencies applying different rules to different kinds of changes, the sub-model versus the cash shop.
Right. So the takeaway for you, the listeners, that understanding these potential logical issues, these historical patterns, gives you a much sharper lens for looking at how these massive live service games are developed.
Absolutely. It helps you see the challenges and maybe some of the traps developers can fall into.
So here's a final thought to chew on. Given everything we've discussed, what principles do you think should guide a game like this? How do you balance keeping things fresh now with building something that lasts and stays true to itself? Definitely something worth thinking about.
Sure.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.